Not during the day, but long before dawn. The room is still black, thick with the kind of darkness that feels textured, as if you could press your thumb into it and leave a mark. The air hangs low and used, sour with yesterday's smoke. You wake because your throat scratches before your thoughts do. Something in your chest tightens, a small reminder that the fire never truly left, it only settled closer to the floor. Most people imagine medieval nights as quiet and peaceful. They picture stars, gentle snores, the soft crackle of a hearth. But you wake to coughing. The fire sits in the center of the room, not tucked politely against a wall, not guided upward by brick or flue. It rests in a shallow pit of ash, ringed by stones blackened into a permanent twilight. This is how most European homes function before chimneys become common. The hearth at the center, the smoke rising where it pleases. There is no funnel to carry it away. It drifts, hesitates, pools. You shift under coarse wool blankets that smell faintly of lanolin and older smoke. The cold presses in from the walls, from the doorframe, from the earth itself. The fire is not a comfort. It is a truce. You sit up, and the room tilts slightly. Your eyes sting. Soot lines the rafters like a second ceiling. It flakes down in soft, silent surrender. Historians still argue whether long-term exposure to indoor smoke significantly shortened average lifespans in rural medieval communities. But you do not need a chart to tell you that breathing this feels wrong. You probably wouldn't last long here. The door is barred against the night. The only opening above is a simple smoke hole in the roof, little more than a gap beneath overlapping thatch. It works when wind agrees to help. Tonight, the air outside is too still. Smoke rises halfway, then curls back, reconsidering its options. You kneel at the hearth and stir the embers. The ash glows reluctantly, as if offended by the interruption. You feed it splinters of wood saved from yesterday oak, if you are fortunate, damp brushwood if you are not. Wood is currency. Wood is labor. Every stick you burn has already cost you time and muscle. A faint flame licks upward, weak but persistent. The smoke thickens before it thins. It is always this way. Warmth arrives trailing consequence. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you sit in this dim room, waiting for heat to decide whether it will stay, you might quietly comment where you are in the world and what time it is there. Think of it as marking a vigil. Somewhere, someone else is awake in the dark with you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The fire steadies. You hold your hands close, palms angled toward the coals. The warmth is uneven. One side of your body thaws while the other remains stiff, as if winter has claimed it outright. Your feet ache first, then your fingers. The accepted truth is simple. Before chimneys spread through Europe in the later Middle Ages, most ordinary homes relied on open central hearths with smoke escaping through roof vents or doors. It sounds primitive when summarized. Living inside, it feels less quaint. You glance upward. The thatch above is darkened and brittle. Soot accumulates there year after year, a quiet threat. Houses sometimes burn from the top down, when a stray spark finds a dry patch and decides to linger. Entire villages can vanish in a single night because warmth is too close to the roof. This is not rare. It is remembered. You rise and open the door a crack to encourage a draft. Cold air slips in like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. The smoke shifts, offended, and begins to stream toward the opening. Your eyes water more fiercely. The price of fresh air is a sharper winter. It is a careful choreography. Too little ventilation, and you choke. Too much, and the fire dies. You learn this balance early. Children here do not fear smoke the way modern children might. They treat it as a relative unpleasant, but permanent. There is something quietly humiliating about shaping your entire night around a flame that refuses to behave. You settle back near the hearth, close enough that sparks sometimes threaten your hem. Your sleeping space is arranged around the fire's geometry. Everything in the house radiates from it: beds, benches, tools, even conversation. The hearth is both center and tyrant. You think briefly of the coming day, gathering more fuel, mending thatch, checking the walls for drafts. Heat does not sustain itself. It must be pursued. And even then, it is unreliable. By modern standards, this would be called hazardous indoor air quality. Back then, it is simply normal. A small, bleak thought occurs to you. At least you do not need an alarm clock. The smoke handles that. You cough again, softer this time, and pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders. The wool scratches. It always scratches. Comfort is a concept with flexible boundaries. Some nights the smoke hangs so low you must crouch to breathe more easily. People learn to sit beneath it, to sleep beneath it, as if the house itself has layers like a pond clearer air near the floor, thicker grief above. An obscure detail survives in records from later centuries. Investigators describing medieval and early modern rafters so thick with soot that they gleamed like polished ebony. Entire interiors lacquered by combustion. You look at those rafters now, barely visible in the gloom, and imagine them decades older, heavier, darker. The house remembers every fire. Outside, frost forms along the edges of the door. Inside, the air tastes faintly metallic. You stretch your hands closer to the flame and feel the prickle of returning sensation. Pins and needles, a small punishment for warmth regained. You accept this trade without ceremony. Not heroic, not romantic, just necessary. The fire crackles louder, briefly triumphant. You feed it another stick and watch the flame rise, uncertain whether it will behave or rebel. You have no chimney to command it upward, no engineered certainty. Only patience and a roof that hopes to breathe. The night continues around you, thick and indifferent. You remain where you are, half warmed, half choked, because this is how people stay alive before chimneys are common. You endure the smoke, and the smoke, in its own way, endures you. You organize your life around the hearth because there is nowhere else to organize it. The fire sits in the center of the room, a dull orange eye that never fully closes. Everything you own faces it. Benches angled inward, bedding arranged in cautious arcs, tools stacked just far enough away that stray sparks might hesitate before reaching them. Living here means accepting that warmth does not belong to any one person. It radiates unevenly, and whoever claims the closest place earns it for the moment. In homes without chimneys, the central hearth is not decoration or comfort. It is architecture. Archaeological excavations across early medieval Europe consistently reveal dwellings built around circular or rectangular hearth pits positioned in the center, sometimes lined with stone, sometimes simply hardened clay. Walls are an afterthought compared to the fire. You build shelter first to contain heat, then to contain yourselves. The smoke gathers slowly this morning, coiling toward the rafters where yesterday's soot already thickens the beams. You notice how the light entering through the door glows faintly gray before reaching the floor. Even sunlight must negotiate its way through the air here. You sit cross-legged and extend your palms toward the heat. One hand warms faster than the other. This is normal. Uneven warmth becomes something you stop noticing like a constant ache that fades only because it refuses to leave. Historians still argue whether households deliberately tolerated heavy indoor smoke because it helped preserve wooden beams and deter insects, or whether that was simply a benefit discovered long after people accepted the discomfort. Either way, the rafters above you carry the evidence. Darkened, hardened, strangely durable. Smoke destroys lungs, but protects timber. Survival rarely bothers to be polite. Someone else in the room shifts in their sleep. Bodies cluster near the fire during winter nights, sometimes arranged head to foot to save space, sometimes overlapping in ways no one comments on. Privacy is a luxury invented later. Warmth comes first. You lean forward and add another log, careful not to disturb the ash too much. When embers scatter, sparks sometimes leap outward, landing on clothing or floor rushes. Small burn marks appear everywhere, over time, on hems, on wooden bowls, even on skin. They become a quiet map of near misses. A faint smell of singed wool rises. You check your sleeve quickly. Nothing yet. That counts as success. There is an obscure but unsettling detail preserved in a handful of early household accounts. Some families deliberately hung strips of damp hide or cloth near the smoke, opening to slow drafts and retain heat, unintentionally trapping even more smoke inside the room. The result is warmer air and heavier breathing. Comfort adjusts its definition again. You stand and nudge the door open another inch. Cold seeps inward, thin but insistent. The smoke responds immediately, leaning toward the opening. It is always a negotiation. Warmth against breath, breath against winter. You learn to measure it by instinct. Too wide, and the fire sulks. Too narrow, and your chest tightens by morning. A small, bleak thought passes through you. At least smoke does not require sweeping. It simply settles everywhere at once. Children raised in houses like this grow accustomed to low ceilings of haze. Some learn early that the clearest air rests closer to the floor, so they play there, crawl there, sometimes even sleep there when the room grows particularly thick. It is an unspoken technique, passed down without instruction. Bend lower, breathe easier. Stand tall, cough more. An elegant system. If you are generous with the word elegant, the hearth crackles louder, briefly assertive. A neighbor once joked that the fire is the only member of the household allowed to eat continuously. No one laughed very hard, mostly because it was true. Fuel must be gathered constantly branches, peat, dung, whatever burns. The fire consumes it all with equal indifference. It is the most dependable appetite, you know. Another accepted historical fact rests quietly beneath your routine. Before the widespread adoption of chimneys, between the 12th and 16th centuries, in many parts of Europe, most ordinary dwellings lacked any vertical flue system, relying instead on smoke holes, open doors, or loosely fitted roofs to vent fumes. The technology that will one day clear these rooms already exists in limited elite settings, but it has not yet reached most people. Progress travels unevenly, like heat itself. You settle back onto the bench and pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The fabric smells permanently of smoke now. Washing helps only briefly. Everything you own carries the same scent, the quiet signature of indoor fires. If someone blindfolded you and placed you inside another household across the village, you would recognize the same smell immediately. Comfort, apparently, has a universal fragrance, faintly burned. A third, dry thought surfaces. At least thieves never need to track you. They just follow the smoke. Outside, dawn approaches, though the sky remains heavy and indistinct. Inside, the fire dictates the rhythm of waking. People rise when warmth reaches their feet, not when light reaches the windows. The difference matters more than you might think. You glance toward the roof opening again. A thin thread of smoke finally escapes upward, carried by a hesitant breeze. For a few moments, the room feels almost clear. You inhale more deeply than usual, surprised each time by how clean air feels when it arrives unannounced. But the wind falters, and the smoke begins to gather again, reclaiming the ceiling inch by inch. It is patient. It always returns. There is something quietly ironic about living at the center of your own heat source while still feeling cold along your back. The fire warms what it sees. Everything else negotiates for the leftovers. You rub your hands together, watching the skin redden slightly from the heat. The day will soon require you to step outside, gather more fuel, repeat the small rituals that keep this fragile warmth alive. Houses without chimneys do not allow complacency. Fire must be coaxed, fed, and tolerated, all at once. You accept this arrangement without ceremony. Everyone does. Because before walls can protect you, before blankets can cover you, before sleep can settle properly into your bones, there is only the hearth smoking, imperfect, indispensable. You sit beside it now, eyes watering slightly, and wait for the warmth to reach the rest of you. It takes longer than you hope. It always does. The roof is supposed to breathe for you. You notice it first when the wind changes. A faint downward drift of smoke replaces the gentle upward pull you had hoped for, and the room darkens not with night, but with thickening air. Above you, the smoke hole nothing more than a narrow opening left between layers of thatch weights for cooperation from the weather. When the wind is right, the smoke lifts like a curtain. When it is wrong, the curtain falls back over you. You glance upward often, as if watching a reluctant sky. Across large parts of early medieval Europe, homes were deliberately built with roof vents or simple louvered openings intended to allow smoke to escape, a practical solution long before the widespread use of vertical chimneys. It works sometimes. The rest of the time, you breathe what lingers. That is the accepted arrangement. This morning, the air outside sits heavy and unmoving. The smoke rises halfway, stalls, and then begins to spread sideways beneath the rafters. A thin gray sheet forms overhead, slowly lowering like a ceiling that has grown tired of waiting. You recognize the pattern immediately. It will be one of those days. You crouch closer to the floor, where the air is marginally clearer. Children learn this instinctively. Adults pretend they chose it deliberately. The difference matters less than the relief it brings. You inhale carefully, aware of how every breath feels slightly thicker than the last. Historians still argue whether households intentionally designed smoke holes of particular sizes to regulate airflow, or whether most openings were simply shaped by convenience and accident, adjusted only after repeated discomfort forced experimentation. Either way, the result remains the same. Some houses breathe better than others, and luck often determines the difference. A faint tapping sound begins overhead as cold droplets from last night's frost melt and fall through the thatch. Moisture changes everything. Damp air weighs down the smoke, keeping it inside longer. Rainy seasons are the worst, when warmth increases, but breathing becomes negotiation. You sometimes wonder which discomfort you dislike more, freezing nights or choking mornings. Neither ever quite wins. A dry thought crosses your mind. At least the smoke hole never needs polishing. It fails without maintenance just fine. You stand and nudge the fire with a stick, spreading the embers slightly to encourage a cleaner burn. Experienced households know that hotter fires produce less lingering smoke, but hotter fires also consume more fuel. Efficiency is a luxury of people with forests nearby. Everyone else chooses between choking slowly or freezing slightly faster. The rafters above you glisten faintly, coated in layers of soot accumulated over years. An obscure detail survives in a few architectural studies. Soot buildup in thatched medieval roofs could eventually act as a partial fire retardant, compacting fibers and reducing their tendency to ignite instantly. Unfortunately, sparks still find ways through. Safety is never complete, only postponed. A small current of wind finally slips through the roof opening, and the smoke shifts upward in response. For a moment, the room clears enough that your eyes stop watering. You straighten slightly, enjoying the rare sensation of breathing without effort. These brief improvements feel almost luxurious. Then the breeze fades, and the haze returns, patient and predictable. You glance toward the doorway, considering whether opening it wider might help, but the cold outside presses hard enough to discourage the idea. Winter air steals warmth with a kind of quiet enthusiasm. Even a small draft can reduce the fire's effectiveness for hours. Houses without chimneys teach you constant arithmetic. How much heat you can afford to lose in exchange for how much air you can afford to gain. Another faint joke drifts through your thoughts. Breathing deeply is considered healthy, but apparently not indoors. The people around you move slowly, conserving warmth, speaking less than they might in summer months. Conversation takes effort when each inhale reminds you of ash. Over time, voices adapt, growing softer, lower, shaped by the air itself. Rooms like this train silence without needing rules. The smoke hole above remains the house's only promise of escape. Some households rig simple coverings, wooden flaps, or hide panels to close the opening during storms, though these often trap even more smoke when forgotten. You check yours occasionally, making sure it has not shifted overnight. A blocked opening can turn discomfort into danger with unsettling speed. Another accepted historical fact sits quietly within your routine. Archaeological evidence from early Northern European longhouses shows roof openings positioned directly above central hearths, confirming that entire building designs revolved around managing smoke long before chimney technology became widespread among ordinary people. The architecture is honest about its priorities. Warmth first, breath if possible. You settle back down, wrapping your cloak tighter around your shoulders. The fabric holds warmth unevenly, its edges still cool where the fire cannot reach. Outside, the day remains gray, the sky pressing low against the village roofs. Weather controls more of your comfort than skill ever could. A second bleak observation surfaces. If smoke had a personality, it would be the guest who never quite leaves, but insists it's doing you a favor. The fire snaps softly, sending a brief scatter of sparks upward. Most fade before reaching the roof. One disappears into the darkness above, unseen. You watch for a moment, listening for any sign of trouble, then return your attention to the coals. Vigilance is part of warmth. Relaxation comes later, if it comes at all. Breathing grows slightly easier again, as another faint draft passes through the roof gap. These small fluctuations shape the rhythm of your day. Inhale, wait, adjust, endure. Houses breathe unevenly, and you learn to match their tempo. You realize, not for the first time, that survival here depends less on comfort than on tolerances, how much smoke you can accept, how much cold you can withstand, how long you can sit in the space between the two. Progress will someday lift the smoke above rooftops entirely, guiding it neatly through brick shafts and iron caps. You sleep beside the embers because distance means cold, and cold is rarely patient. The fire never truly goes out at night. It collapses inward, glowing quietly beneath the thin skin of ash, like something resting but still aware. Before lying down, you rake the coals carefully into a tighter mound, covering them just enough to slow their fading. In the morning, you will coax them back to life, saving the effort of striking a new flame. Fire starting takes time. Preserving embers takes vigilance. So you sleep near them, closer than comfort might recommend, farther than fear might allow. Across much of medieval Europe, especially in peasant households, it was common practice to bank fires overnight precisely this way, maintaining small glowing cores beneath ash to ensure heat and easier rekindling by dawn. It is an efficient system, though efficiency sometimes carries its own quiet risks. Embers shift. Ash settles unpredictably. Floors are often scattered with rushes, straw, or worn wooden boards that have seen too many sparks over too many winters. You stretch out on your bedding, a layered arrangement of wool, rough linen, and whatever additional cloth the household can spare. The warmth reaches you unevenly. Your face warms first, then your hands. Your feet remain stubbornly cold as if they belong to someone else entirely. You tuck them closer to the blankets, hoping circulation negotiates in your favor. The room dims further as the last active flames disappear, leaving only the faint red glow of coals. Shadows gather along the walls, and the ceiling above becomes invisible, except for the occasional shimmer of soot-catching reflected light. You listen to the quiet crackle that continues even after visible fire has vanished. Wood settles, ash shifts. Small sounds reassure you that the heat still lives. Historians still argue whether accidental nighttime fires caused more damage than the cold they prevented, or whether most households simply accepted the risk because letting the hearth die entirely could be equally dangerous in harsh winters. Records of burned cottages exist, but so do accounts of frostbite and illness following nights without sufficient heat. Survival offers few perfect choices. You turn onto your side, angling your body so the fire warms your chest rather than your back. This position becomes habit over time. Many people learn to sleep curled toward the hearth, unconsciously aligning themselves with the only steady heat source available. Rooms without chimneys teach bodies to adapt in quiet ways postures, shaped by survival rather than comfort. A small, bleak thought drifts through your mind. At least if the house catches fire, you will already be close enough to notice. The embers shift slightly, sending a faint sprinkle of sparks outward. Most die instantly, fading into harmless darkness. One lands a short distance away, glowing for a moment before disappearing into the floor rushes. You watch it carefully until the glow fades entirely. Watching becomes second nature. Even half asleep, you listen for the wrong kind of crackle, the sharper one that signals trouble. There is an obscure but unsettling detail mentioned in several early household instructions. Some families placed flat stones or metal plates around the hearth, edge specifically to prevent stray embers from reaching bedding, though many poorer homes lacked the materials to do this consistently. The result is a patchwork of protective measures, some effective, some hopeful, all temporary. You pull the blanket higher over your shoulder. Wool scratches your skin, but it holds warmth better than most alternatives. The smell of smoke clings permanently to the fibers, impossible to wash out completely. Over time, people begin to associate that smell, not with discomfort, but with safety. A room that smells strongly of smoke is at least a room that is warm. Another dry observation crosses your thoughts. Modern people worry about thread counts. You worry about whether the blanket might ignite. Someone across the room coughs in their sleep, a quiet reminder that everyone shares the same air. The embers glow a little brighter as a pocket of heat collapses inward. For a few minutes, the warmth intensifies, reaching farther across the floor. Then it settles again, subdued. You drift towards sleep, though never entirely surrendering to it. Nights like this encourage a kind of partial rest, one ear attentive, one eye occasionally opening to check the fire's position. Full, uninterrupted sleep belongs to warmer centuries. Here, rest is negotiated in installments. Another accepted historical fact rests quietly beneath the moment. Many medieval homes lacked separate bedrooms, meaning entire families often slept in the same central room where the hearth burned, increasing both shared warmth and shared exposure to smoke and accidental fire hazards. Privacy is sacrificed to survival without discussion. A faint pop from the hearth draws your attention again. A small fragment of charcoal breaks apart, shifting the embers slightly closer to the edge of the pit. You consider rising to adjust them, but decide the movement is minor enough to watch for now. Experience teaches you which sounds require action and which can be tolerated. Sleep becomes lighter because it must. Historians still argue whether people of this era experienced significantly more fragmented sleep patterns due to fire tending and nighttime hazards, or whether modern assumptions exaggerate the disruption. From where you lie, the answer feels obvious. Even dreams seem cautious. A third, restrained joke passes quietly through your thoughts. Nothing encourages mindfulness quite like sleeping next to something that might burn your house down. Outside, the wind brushes faintly against the roof, shifting the thatch with a soft rustle. Inside, the embers continue their slow, breathing glow. You feel the warmth along one side of your body, the chill along the other, the steady compromise that defines most winter nights. The arrangement is imperfect, but functional. That is enough. Eventually, your breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the coals. The room settles into a fragile stillness, one spark away from chaos. You bring the animals inside because their warmth does not ask permission. The first time you share your shelter with livestock, it feels temporary. A solution for one especially bitter night. But winter stretches longer than pride, and soon the arrangement becomes seasonal habit. A cow exhales heavily near the far wall. A goat shifts and stamps a hoof. Somewhere in the dimness, a chicken rustles in its crate, irritated by the rearrangement of space. Before chimneys, before insulated walls, before the idea that animals belong strictly outdoors, many rural households across medieval Europe housed livestock under the same roof as the family, sometimes separated by a low partition, sometimes not separated at all. The practice was practical. A single cow can radiate significant body heat. Several animals together create a small climate of their own. Heat is heat regardless of its source. You sit near the hearth and feel not only the fire's uneven warmth, but the slow, living warmth from the other side of the room. It is different, less sharp, more humid. It carries a scent you never fully escape. The smell arrives first each evening earthy, sour, unmistakable. Manure, damp straw, warm hide. You grow used to it because you must. Over time, the air inside your home becomes a layered mixture. Smoke above, animal breath at mid-height, ash and straw near the floor. Clean air exists somewhere beyond the walls, but that is not where you sleep. Historians still argue whether this shared living arrangement significantly improved survival rates during harsh winters, or whether its benefits have been slightly romanticized in hindsight. What is certain is that insulation was limited, fuel was scarce, and animals provided both warmth and economic security. Bringing them indoors was less sentiment and more arithmetic. You glance toward the cow as it shifts again, its flank rising and falling steadily. The heat radiating from its body softens the cold creeping along the walls. The partition between you is low enough that its breath sometimes drifts into your space. In return, your fire warms its stall. It is a partnership built on necessity. A small, bleak thought crosses your mind. At least the cow does not complain about the smoke. The animals tolerate it better than you might expect. Or perhaps they simply endure it differently. Their eyes water less visibly. Their lungs, however, do not have the luxury of protest. An obscure but unsettling detail, preserved in a few agricultural studies, suggests that prolonged indoor smoke exposure likely affected livestock health as well, potentially reducing productivity over time. Survival, once again, distributes its costs evenly. You move closer to the hearth, aware that the combined heat of fire and animal breath makes the air thicker. Warmer, yes. Easier to breathe, not necessarily. The trade-off sharpens in still weather. On nights when wind refuses to cooperate with the smoke hole, the room can grow heavy enough that both humans and animals grow restless. The goat coughs a small, abrupt sound. You glance toward it instinctively, then look back at the embers. Everyone here shares the same atmosphere, for better or worse. Another dry observation slips through your thoughts. Modern homes have air fresheners. You have a goat. Straw covers much of the floor, replenished regularly to absorb waste and dampness. It insulates slightly, though it also introduces new risks. Dry straw near open embers requires attention. You make small adjustments with your foot, nudging stray pieces farther from the hearth's edge. Fire and fodder are uneasy neighbors. Across parts of northern Europe, longhouses were deliberately constructed with one end dedicated to animals and the other to human habitation, separated by wooden dividers, but sharing the same roof structure. The architectural logic was simple. Fewer exterior walls meant less heat loss. When fuel supplies dwindled during long winters, the warmth of livestock could mean the difference between endurance and illness. You notice how the air shifts subtly when the cow exhales deeply, a slow wave of warmth rolling outward. It reaches you more gently than the fire does. There is something strangely comforting about that steady rhythm life generating heat without flame. The animals do not flicker or spark. They simply breathe. Historians still argue whether the psychological effect of sharing space with animals provided comfort or merely compounded stress during difficult seasons. From where you sit, it feels like both. The sounds, shuffling hooves, soft snorts, the occasional restless movement prevent complete silence. Silence, in winter, can feel like a warning. A third restrained joke forms quietly. If privacy were warmth, you would be freezing. You adjust your blanket around your shoulders and lean back against the wall, feeling the faint transfer of animal heat through wood and air. The fire continues its uneven crackle, sparks rising briefly before disappearing into soot-dark rafters. The combined warmth of flame and flesh stabilizes the room just enough to make sleep possible. The smell lingers, persistent and complex. Over time, it becomes indistinguishable from home itself. When you step outside into sharp winter air, the cold feels cleaner but also emptier. Inside, the air is heavier, yes, but alive. You look at the cow again, at the slow certainty of its breathing. It does not question the arrangement. It accepts the warmth of your fire as readily as you accept its body heat. Survival encourages unlikely companionships. Another accepted historical fact rests quietly in the background. Medieval legal codes and estate records frequently mention buyers integrated into domestic structures, confirming that animal cohabitation was not an anomaly, but a widespread strategy in colder climates. This is not a quaint rural exception. It is common practice. You shift your weight and close your eyes briefly, letting the layered warmth settle around you. The smoke above remains, thin but persistent. You enter the longhouse and realize warmth can be crowded. The doorway hangs low, forcing you to bow slightly as you step inside. The moment you cross the threshold, the air changes thicker, warmer, layered with the breath of many people and the steady persistence of several fires spaced along the central aisle. The heat is undeniable. So is the smoke. Longhouses across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and parts of Northern Europe were often built as elongated timber halls designed to shelter entire extended families. Workers, and sometimes animals beneath a single roof. Multiple hearths burned along the interior, each without a chimney, their smoke rising toward roof vents that functioned only as well as the weather allowed. When the wind cooperated, the air cleared somewhat. When it did not, the building became a slow-moving cloud. You walk farther inside, past sleeping pallets arranged in lines along the walls. The rafters above are darkened to a uniform sheen, layers of soot polished over years of rising smoke. Light enters through narrow openings and catches the haze in pale shafts, turning the interior into a dim corridor of drifting gray. The warmth feels communal, but breathing requires patience. Historians still argue whether inhabitants of large longhouses became physiologically more tolerant of smoky conditions over generations, or whether the discomfort remained constant and simply unavoidable. From the way people blink slowly and rub their eyes without comment, it appears that adaptation does not always mean relief. A group of sleepers stirs near the nearest hearth. Someone rises quietly, adding a piece of wood to the embers. Flames lift briefly, sending a fresh wave of smoke upward. The draft is weak today. The smoke spreads along the ceiling before slowly drifting toward the roof openings. It will leave eventually. Eventually is the operative word. You take a seat on a low bench, feeling the combined warmth of several fires reach you at once. It is stronger than in a small cottage, but less predictable. Hot pockets form near one hearth, while cooler shadows linger between them. People shift positions throughout the evening, not from restlessness, but from thermal negotiation subtle movements to find the least uncomfortable place to sit. A dry thought crosses your mind. Communal living is easier when everyone smells equally smoky. An accepted historical fact lies quietly beneath the scene. Excavations of Viking-age longhouses reveal extensive soot deposits along interior roof beams, confirming that large communal structures operated for centuries without chimneys, relying instead on open roof vents or smoke-permeable thatching to release fumes. The scale of the building does not eliminate smoke. It simply distributes it more democratically. You glance upward. The roof ridge runs the entire length of the hall, interrupted by several vent openings designed to encourage upward airflow. When wind sweeps across the roof from the correct direction, smoke streams outward efficiently. People here learn to read the weather by the way the smoke behaves. A slow sideways drift means calm skies. A sharp downward push signals incoming rain or shifting winds. Long before instruments measure pressure changes, the ceiling of haze serves as a living forecast. Near the far end of the hall, animals shift behind a low wooden barrier. Their presence adds both warmth and moisture to the air, deepening the layered scent of wood smoke, wool, and damp straw. The combined effect is unmistakable. Outsiders sometimes find it overwhelming. Residents stop noticing after a few winters, or at least pretend to. An obscure but unsettling detail appears in several preservation studies. The soot coating accumulated inside longhouses sometimes became so thick that flakes would occasionally detach and fall like black snow during strong interior drafts, lightly dusting food clothing and bedding without ceremony. Cleanliness becomes a flexible concept when survival occupies the center of daily life. You brush your sleeve absently, imagining such flakes settling there. Another small adjustment to existence. Nothing dramatic, just persistent. Someone nearby coughs a quiet, habitual sound rather than a dramatic one. The hall absorbs it without reaction. Coughing belongs to the background here, like the crackle of wood or the shuffle of boots across packed earth floors. A second restrained joke forms in your mind. At least no one worries about candle smoke ruining the air. You lean forward, extending your hands toward the nearest hearth. The warmth feels immediate, almost generous compared to smaller homes. You trust the brazier because it looks smaller than the hearth. It sits beside you, a shallow metal basin filled with glowing charcoal, modest and contained, its warmth radiating outward in a quiet circle. Unlike the open hearth, it does not demand the center of the room. It promises portability, heat that can follow you rather than heat you must follow. On cold evenings, that promise feels almost luxurious. Across parts of medieval and early modern Europe, especially in smaller urban dwellings or rooms without dedicated hearth space, charcoal braziers were commonly used to provide localized warmth. They required less wood, produced a steady heat, and could be moved closer to sleeping areas. Efficiency, once again, comes with conditions rarely explained in advance. You extend your hands over the brazier and feel warmth spread more evenly than the flickering heat of open flames. The charcoal glows steadily, almost politely. It does not crackle or spit sparks. It does not demand constant feeding. It simply burns, silent and dependable. That silence is part of the problem. Historians still argue whether widespread awareness of charcoal fumes developed slowly through painful experience, or whether people recognized the danger earlier but accepted the risk as unavoidable in poorly ventilated homes. What is certain is that charcoal combustion produces carbon monoxide odorless, invisible, impossible to notice until symptoms begin. The knowledge exists now. Here, it does not yet have a name. You shift the brazier slightly closer, appreciating how quickly the warmth reaches your legs. The room itself remains cold, but your immediate space becomes tolerable. Many households rely on this strategy. Warm the body directly rather than the entire structure. It is economical. It is also quietly treacherous. An obscure but unsettling detail appears in several later municipal records. Authorities in some early modern European cities occasionally issued warnings about the dangers of sleeping in tightly sealed rooms with lit braziers after multiple unexplained nighttime deaths were eventually traced back to charcoal fumes. The instructions arrived only after the pattern became impossible to ignore. You lean back against the wall, letting the heat settle into your clothing. The charcoal's glow pulses gently, as if breathing. Unlike the open hearth, it produces less visible smoke, which makes the air appear cleaner. Appearances can be persuasive. A dry thought passes through your mind. At least the danger here is considerate enough not to smell. Another accepted historical fact rests quietly within the moment. Portable braziers were widely used not only in homes, but also in workshops, guard posts, and travel settings. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, precisely because their compact heat source offered flexibility, where fixed hearths could not. Technology improves convenience faster than it improves safety. Someone across the room opens a window slightly, allowing a narrow ribbon of cold air to slip inside. You notice the faint draft brushing your cheek. Ventilation matters more than anyone fully understands yet, though experience teaches its own lessons. People who wake dizzy or nauseated learn, eventually, to crack doors open during the night, even in winter. Historians still argue whether these behavioral adaptations spread primarily through oral warnings, local customs, or repeated tragedies that communities quietly remembered without recording formally. Written evidence appears sporadically, but the habits themselves travel more quickly than official instructions. You glance down at the brazier again. Its steady glow looks harmless, almost elegant compared to the unruly open hearth. Sparks do not leap from it. Ash remains contained. It offers the illusion of control. Illusions often make endurance easier. A second restrained joke forms in your thoughts. Nothing inspires confidence like a heat source that can quietly end the conversation. You shift your feet slightly closer, careful not to brush the metal rim. The surface becomes dangerously hot during extended use. Burns happen quickly, often when someone stands too fast or forgets the brazier's position in the dark. Small circular scars on floors and clothing tell stories no one bothers to retell. The room grows quieter as night deepens. Some people move their braziers near their sleeping mats, hoping to retain warmth longer. Others leave them farther away, wary of accidents. Practices vary, guided more by experience than instruction. Safety in these rooms is negotiated individually. A third bleak observation drifts through your mind. Warmth that follows you around is convenient, but so are most mistakes. The charcoal continues its slow, silent burn. You trust the walls to remember the heat you cannot hold. Stone surrounds you on three sides, thick and unmoving, its surface cool even when the fire has burned for hours. The builders who raised this structure did not rely on thin timber alone. They stacked fieldstone and packed earth between layers, creating walls wide enough to sit inside if necessary. The idea is simple. Heavy materials absorb warmth slowly and release it just as slowly. In theory, the room should stay warmer longer after the fire fades. In practice, the walls remember only what they are given. Across many regions of Europe, particularly in colder or wind-exposed areas, homes and storage buildings were constructed with thick masonry or earthen walls, specifically to improve thermal stability. Archaeological measurements show that some rural stone walls exceeded 0.5 meter in thickness, an intentional effort to buffer interiors against rapid temperature swings. The design works best when the fire burns steadily for long periods. When fuel runs short, the walls hold very little to return. You press your palm lightly against the stone and feel its lingering chill. Hours of burning have barely softened it. The hearth glows behind you, working patiently to warm materials that resist quick persuasion. Heat moves slowly through mass. Winter moves quickly through everything else. Historians still argue whether medieval builders fully understood the insulating principles of thick masonry, or whether these construction styles emerged primarily from structural needs and material availability, with thermal benefits discovered gradually through experience. Either way, the result surrounds you now solid, protective, and never quite warm enough. A faint draft slips along the floor where stone meets wood, a reminder that thickness does not eliminate every gap. You tuck your feet farther beneath your cloak, watching the firelight flicker across uneven surfaces. The walls catch the glow, but do not return it with enthusiasm. An obscure but unsettling detail appears in several preservation studies. During especially harsh winters, moisture trapped within thick stone or earthen walls could freeze internally, forming tiny cracks that gradually weaken structures over time, sometimes leading to sudden collapses seasons later when thawing expanded the fractures. Even warmth stored imperfectly leaves consequences behind. You glance upward at the ceiling beams, darkened by years of smoke that never fully escaped. The soot clings there, while the stone below remains stubbornly cool. Houses remember heat unevenly. Some surfaces hold it, others refuse. A dry observation passes quietly through your thoughts. At least the walls do not complain about the cold. They simply enforce it. You sit closer to the hearth and extend your hands again, feeling warmth gather across your palms while your back remains chilled. Thick walls reduce wind penetration, yes, but they also slow the distribution of heat within the room. Without chimneys to channel smoke upward efficiently, much of the fire's energy dissipates into ventilation compromises rather than sustained interior warmth. Another accepted historical fact rests quietly beneath the moment. Many early European dwellings relied not only on open hearths, but also on earthen or stone floors that functioned as thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it gradually overnight, though effectiveness varied widely depending on fuel supply and building design. The concept is sound. The execution depends on resources few households possess in abundance. You shift your position, leaning one shoulder toward the fire while pressing the other against the wall, testing the contrast. The difference is immediate: one side tingling with warmth, the other nearly numb. You rotate slowly, warming different parts of your body in sequence, a small ritual repeated throughout the evening. Historians still argue whether the psychological reassurance of thick, fortress-like walls contributed as much to perceived comfort as their actual thermal performance. Feeling protected from wind and predators matters, even if the interior remains cold. Security and warmth do not always arrive together. Outside, the wind picks up slightly, brushing against the building with a low, hollow sound. Inside, the temperature barely shifts. The walls do their job keeping sudden gusts from stealing what little heat the fire produces. They defend against the elements without fully defeating them. A second restrained joke emerges quietly. At least the walls are consistent: cold yesterday, cold today, cold tomorrow. You rise and add another log to the hearth, watching sparks climb briefly before vanishing beneath the soot-dark rafters. The fire answers. Have you ever wondered how people survived the brutal winters of the Middle Ages? Long before central heating and high-tech thermal gear, staying warm was a matter of life and death. The secret wasn't just one thing. It was a clever combination of materials, techniques, and a deep understanding of their environment. Let's journey back in time and uncover how our medieval ancestors truly conquered the cold. Forget everything you think you know from movies and fantasy shows. The real story of medieval winter life is far more fascinating. At the heart of it all was one miracle fiber: wool. Wool was the cornerstone of survival, a gift from the millions of sheep that dotted the European landscape. Why wool? It possesses incredible properties. Even when damp, it retains a significant amount of its insulating ability. It's breathable, durable, and naturally water-resistant thanks to the lanolin in the fibers. This wasn't just a fabric. It was medieval high-tech gear. Every person, from the humblest peasant to the wealthiest lord, relied on wool. The process began in the fields. Shepherds tended their flocks, and twice a year, at shearing time, the raw fleece was gathered. This fleece was a matted, greasy mess, filled with dirt and lanolin. The first step was cleaning, a laborious process of washing and picking out debris. Then came carding or combing, where iron-toothed tools were used to align the wool fibers, preparing them for spinning. Spinning was a task that consumed countless hours, primarily done by women using a simple drop spindle or, later, a spinning wheel. They would twist the prepared wool fibers into a continuous thread or yarn. This yarn was then dyed using natural materials found in the local environment plants, like woad for blue, madder root for red, and weld for yellow. The colors weren't just for show. They could indicate social status and regional identity. Finally, the dyed yarn was woven into cloth on large wooden looms. This was often a specialized craft, producing everything from rough, homespun fabrics for the poor to incredibly fine, soft broadcloths for the rich. The quality and texture of the wool fabric varied immensely, and this difference was a clear marker of social standing. A peasant's tunic might be made of coarse, undyed wool, while a noble's cloak would be a vibrant, finely woven cloth that was soft to the touch. But having the right material was only half the battle. The real key to warmth was layering. People in the Middle Ages were masters of this technique. Let's build a typical medieval outfit from the inside out. The base layer, worn next to the skin, was usually made of linen. Linen, derived from the flax plant, is absorbent and comfortable, wicking sweat away from the body. A peasant might wear a simple linen shirt and brise, which were loose-fitting trousers. A noblewoman would wear a long linen chemise. This linen layer kept the outer wool garments cleaner for longer, which was crucial since washing heavy wool was an ordeal. Over the linen, the wool layers began. The next garment would typically be a tunic or kirtle, a long-sleeved woolen garment that might reach the knees or ankles. This was the everyday staple. For extra warmth, another, slightly looser tunic could be worn over the first. Think of it as a medieval sweater. The combination of the inner linen layer and the outer wool layers created pockets of trapped air. This trapped air, warmed by body heat, formed an insulating barrier against the cold. Next came the legs. Men wore woolen hose, which were essentially two separate leggings tied to their brise or a belt. Women also wore hose, held up with garters. These were crucial for keeping the lower body warm, especially when working outdoors. And on their feet, simple leather turn shoes were the norm for most people. To insulate them, they might stuff them with straw, moss, or scraps of wool cloth, creating a primitive but effective liner. Wealthier individuals might have boots lined with fur. The final, and perhaps most important, layer was the outerwear. This was the main defense against wind, rain, and snow. A simple hooded wool cloak was common for all classes. For those who could afford it, a surcoat or a houppelande voluminous, often pleated outer gown provided an extra layer of luxurious warmth. The ultimate status symbol was fur. While peasants might use rabbit or squirrel fur to line their hoods and cuffs, the nobility had access to expensive furs like ermine, sable, and fox. A fur-lined cloak was not just incredibly warm. It was a public declaration of wealth and power. Headwear was also non-negotiable. A huge amount of body heat is lost through the head, and medieval people knew this. Simple wool coifs, hoods, and hats were universal. A hood attached to a short cape, called a chaperon, was especially popular, protecting the head, neck, and shoulders all at once. For hands, woolen mittens or leather gloves provided protection against frostbite. So you're dressed in layers of linen and wool, with a heavy cloak and a warm hood. You're ready to face the elements. But clothing alone wasn't enough. The other half of the survival equation was fire. The hearth was the heart of the medieval home. In a peasant's simple one-room cottage, the central hearth provided light, a place to cook, and most importantly, radiant heat. The smoke would escape through a simple hole in the roof. It was smoky and inefficient, but it was a lifeline. In castles and manor houses, the technology was more advanced. Wall fireplaces with chimneys became more common from the 12th century onward. This was a revolutionary invention. It channeled the smoke out of the room, allowing for larger, hotter fires without filling the space with soot and fumes. A great hall with a roaring fireplace was the social and functional center of the castle during winter. People would gather near its warmth to eat, work, and socialize. Tapestries were hung on the cold stone walls, not just for decoration, but to provide an extra layer of insulation, trapping heat in the room. The partnership between textiles and fire was fundamental. Your layered wool clothing trapped your body heat, creating a personal microclimate. When you came in from the cold, you stood by the fire not just to warm your skin, but to dry your damp outer layers and warm the air trapped within your clothes. The lanolin in the wool helped repel moisture from the outside, while the fire helped drive out any dampness that got through. Life didn't stop in the winter. Farm work continued, travel was necessary, and battles were still fought. People adapted. They understood the properties of their materials and the power of fire. They knew that staying dry was as important as staying warm. They built their world around the hearth and wrapped themselves in the incredible natural technology of wool. So the next time you pull on a cozy wool sweater, take a moment to appreciate the long history behind it. The simple act of layering clothes and huddling by a fire is a tradition that stretches back centuries. It's a testament to human ingenuity. You close the room smaller so the warmth does not escape. Large spaces are impressive in summer, but in winter, they feel like empty containers that swallow heat without gratitude. So you divide them. Curtains hang across doorways. Wooden partitions slide into place. Beds are tucked behind thick textiles that trap warmer air in narrow sleeping alcoves. Instead of heating the entire house, you shrink the portion that must remain livable. Across medieval Europe, households frequently used heavy woolen hangings, tapestries, or simple fabric curtains, not only for decoration, but to block drafts and create smaller interior zones that retained heat more efficiently. Written estate inventories mention such textiles alongside bedding and clothing, recognizing them as practical insulation rather than luxury ornament. Warmth favors smaller volumes. You draw a thick curtain across the doorway now, watching it settle into place with a soft fold. Immediately, the air inside the sleeping area feels slightly different, still cool, but less exposed to the faint currents drifting through the larger room. The difference is subtle, yet unmistakable. Even a modest barrier changes how heat lingers. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of interior textiles for thermal control developed independently in multiple regions or spread gradually through trade and cultural exchange as households observed effective practices elsewhere. The origins matter less than the result. Rooms that can be reshaped according to season. A faint line of colder air seeps beneath the curtain's lower edge. You tuck a rolled piece of cloth along the floor to block the gap, a small technique passed down without instruction. Drafts rarely disappear entirely, but they can be persuaded to take longer routes. An obscure but unsettling detail appears in several preservation records. Heavy wall hangings and bed curtains, while effective at trapping warmth, also accumulated layers of soot, dust, and insects over time, occasionally becoming sources of hidden infestations or respiratory irritation when disturbed. Insulation collects more than heat. You step back and sit on the edge of the bed platform, pulling a blanket across your lap. The enclosed space now holds a pocket of still air that gradually warms from body heat alone. Even without adding fuel to the fire, the temperature difference becomes noticeable after a few minutes. Containment matters as much as generation. A dry observation crosses your thoughts, Winter comfort often involves pretending the rest of the house does not exist. Another accepted historical fact rests quietly beneath the moment. In wealthier medieval households, elaborately carved canopy beds, surrounded by thick curtains, serve not only symbolic or decorative purposes, but also practical ones, creating enclosed microenvironments that conserve body heat during cold nights in otherwise poorly heated chambers. Architecture adapts at every scale, from buildings to furniture. You reach out and adjust the curtain slightly, ensuring it overlaps fully at the center. Small gaps undo larger efforts. Winter teaches attention to detail with unusual persistence. Outside the enclosed sleeping area, the main room remains cooler, the fire's warmth spreading thinly across open space. Inside, the difference grows slowly but steadily. Your breath feels less sharp in the air. The blanket warms faster. The stillness becomes noticeable. Historians still argue whether people of colder centuries perceived these small temperature differences more acutely than modern individuals accustomed to consistent indoor heating, or whether the human body simply adapts its expectations over time. From your perspective, even a slight improvement feels significant. You lie back briefly and feel the retained warmth beneath the covers, faint but encouraging. This technique, shrinking the living space, requires no additional fuel, only fabric and patience. In seasons when firewood runs low, such adjustments can mean the difference between tolerable nights and restless ones. A second restrained joke forms quietly. Heating a smaller room feels efficient, until you realize the rest of the house is still winning. You sit up again and listen. Beyond the curtain, the house makes its usual winter sounds. Distant crackling from the hearth, occasional movement of someone crossing the floor, the faint brush of wind against the outer walls. Inside the enclosed space, those sounds soften slightly, as though filtered through cloth. Even noise becomes warmer. You pull another blanket across your shoulders, letting the layered textiles create a small chamber of retained warmth. Over time, the combination of curtains, bedding, and body heat builds a microclimate that holds steady through the night, especially when several people share the same enclosed area. Communal sleeping arrangements often serve thermal logic as much as social custom. A third bleak thought drifts gently through your mind. Privacy is warmer than dignity, and both are negotiable. You glance once more at the curtain, satisfied that it hangs properly, and settle back against. You learn to keep moving, because stillness steals warmth faster than the fire does. Even seated by the hearth, you shift weight from one foot to another, flex fingers, roll shoulders. Every small motion circulates blood, creating heat that the fire cannot generate alone. A body at rest grows cold quickly, regardless of blankets or embers. You notice the slow stiffening of joints when you pause for more than a few minutes, a quiet reminder that survival favors attention. Across medieval Europe, peasants and artisans alike adopted habitual movement indoors during winter, not for exercise, but for thermoregulation. Children played quietly near fires. Adults bent to household tasks. Even reading or spinning became micro-workouts. Observing the rhythms of indoor activity, archaeologists infer that everyday labor doubled as a necessary means of retaining heat. You stand briefly to stir the embers, letting sparks fly upward, knowing they will die before they reach the rafters. The action is small but effective. Even shifting coals slightly releases additional warmth and prevents the fire from choking on accumulated ash. Habit replaces calculation. Historians still argue whether these repeated small movements had long-term physiological effects, subtly conditioning people for endurance in cold environments, or whether adaptation was purely situational and temporary. Either way, you feel it now, the difference between heat in motion and heat in stasis. A faint dry joke enters your mind. The fire complains less when you shuffle constantly, but the floorboards squeak more. You move toward a corner where stored water in clay jars has begun to cool. Even here, proximity matters. When handling vessels, a warm hand can transfer heat to the surrounding room. When you set them down, you realize that most stored water has already reached the room as average temperature, a slow compromise between survival and convenience. An obscure yet unsettling detail lingers. Prolonged exposure to cold, damp floors was linked to joint pain and respiratory distress. People learned to limit contact with the bare earth, improvising small raised platforms of straw or wood, but comfort remained conditional. Every convenience exacts a price. You shift again, noticing how your movements cause blankets and clothing to rub, generating frictional warmth. It is minor, almost negligible by modern standards, yet here it feels substantial. You accept microheat wherever it arises. Another accepted historical fact. Anthropological studies suggest that layered, constantly moving households experienced fewer instances of hypothermia indoors, not because the structures were well heated, but because people perpetually generated their own heat through habitual activity. Stasis kills slowly. Motion prolongs life incrementally. You bend to check the animals huddled along the wall, brushing stray straw and adjusting their bedding. Their presence radiates warmth, yes, but your attention to their small needs keeps you moving and awake, a subtle partnership between heat, labor, and vigilance. Historians still argue whether such continuous movement was consciously recognized as thorough regulation or simply embedded in the rhythm of daily chores. From your perspective, the distinction seems irrelevant. Survival rewards repetition, not theory. A second dry thought occurs. If only yawns generated warmth, you would be invincible. You return to the fire and shift your hands above it again. The coals glow a little brighter as heat gathers toward you. You rotate slowly, flexing arms, moving legs beneath the layered blankets, allowing every motion to redistribute warmth where it is needed. Stillness becomes an indulgence rarely tolerated. A third bleak observation arrives quietly. The room never stops reminding you that warmth is temporary, borrowed, and requires constant labor to retain. You settle briefly against the wall, breathing slowly, but your body continues subtle movements: foot taps, shoulder rolls, fingers brushing the rough fabric of your cloak. Every twitch of motion maintains heat. Every pause risks the slow creep of cold. The fire crackles softly, encouraging rhythm, while the smoke drifts overhead in a lazy, unpredictable current. You understand now that movement is not just survival. It is participation in the slow choreography of indoor winter life. Without it, the house stone, timber, you trade air for warmth, because the two rarely coexist comfortably. Opening a window feels like admitting defeat, yet closing it entirely guarantees stagnation. Smoke gathers in lazy eddies beneath the ceiling, curling down in gray fingers that tug at your eyes. You breathe carefully, shallowly at first, testing tolerance. Each inhalation carries a small risk of dizziness, an almost imperceptible discomfort that teaches patience. Air is precious, so is heat. You cannot have both fully. In medieval homes, especially before chimneys were common, ventilation was managed primarily through small roof openings, unglazed windows, and doors. Every intentional breath of fresh air reduced smoke accumulation, but simultaneously drew away precious warmth. Households learned to negotiate constantly between suffocating heat and freezing clarity, a balance dictated by seasons, winds, and fire size. You adjust the shutter slightly, just enough to allow a thin stream of colder air inside. Instantly, the room responds. Smoke curls upward more freely, embers burn a little brighter, but your fingers and toes notice the intrusion. Winter teaches compromise in microforms. Every adjustment is a negotiation. Historians still argue whether families understood these dynamics consciously, or whether the behavior emerged through trial, error, and quiet observation. From your perspective, the lesson is immediate. Survival favors compromise over mastery. A faint, dry thought slips through your mind. Nothing encourages patience like deciding which discomfort to endure first. You step closer to the hearth and fan the embers slightly, nudging the fire into a better burn. The movement improves air quality marginally, the smoke drawing upward and out through the roof vent. The room feels lighter for a moment. Relief is partial, ephemeral, but noticeable. An obscure yet unsettling detail appears in several contemporary accounts. Chronic smoke exposure, even from carefully managed fires, could contribute to respiratory issues, eye irritation, and lingering headaches. Households rarely recorded it formally. It was an accepted, quiet cost of warmth. People grew accustomed to discomfort, normalizing it as they might normalize seasonal storms. You watch the room respond to adjustments, the way smoke moves, the subtle rise in ember glow, the faint currents along the walls. Observation becomes a skill, almost an instinct. Winter teaches you to read the invisible. Air currents, the faintest draft, the direction of smoke. Each element is a signal of comfort or warning. Another accepted historical fact: records of urban dwellings in medieval London and Paris often describe smoke rooms, or poorly ventilated chambers where inhabitants intentionally tolerated thick fumes to preserve warmth overnight. It was a calculated inconvenience, not a mistake. You step back from the window, closing it partially again. The room darkens slightly as the narrow ribbon of light from outside diminishes, but the warmth feels steadier. The trade has been made. You learn that the invisible price of oxygen often outweighs the fleeting relief of cool air. Historians still argue whether these breathing compromises contributed to long-term health consequences that were unrecognized at the time, or whether adaptation mitigated effects over generations. The answer seems unprovable. You focus on the tangible: warmth in your hands, smoke curling above. A second restrained joke forms quietly. Breathing clearly is overrated when you have fire. You sit near the hearth once more, noticing how even minor drafts shift the smoke, cool fingers, and affect perception. The room exists in tension between comfort and risk, clarity and suffocation, vigilance and fatigue. Each inhalation demands assessment. A third bleak thought emerges softly. Warmth is never free, and the cost is often invisible until it whispers in your head. You adjust your cloak, settle back, and allow yourself to exist in the subtle, uneasy balance between smoke and air, understanding that negotiation is a nightly necessity, and full relief is forever postponed. You lie down beside warmth that fades faster than sleep arrives. The fire looks steady when your eyes close, but it is never steady for long. Embers shift, collapse inward, glow brightly for a moment, and dull again as if reconsidering their usefulness. You understand this rhythm intimately. Warmth is temporary, especially through the long stretch of night, and you must prepare for the slow betrayal of cooling stone and thinning heat. In homes without chimneys, maintaining overnight warmth required careful preparation before sleep. Larger pieces of wood were often added shortly before bedding down, so that the fire would smolder for hours rather than burn fiercely and vanish. It was less about comfort and more about endurance stretching heat the way one stretches scarce food. You pull your blanket tighter, aware that the first hours of night will be tolerable. Later, near the darkest stretch before dawn, cold will creep back in quietly, settling along the floor and rising inch by inch. You have experienced this enough times to know the exact moment when your body wakes not from rest, but from temperature. Historians still argue whether people slept continuously through the night in such environments, or practiced segmented sleep partly because fires required tending. The evidence is scattered diaries suggesting midnight waking, household instructions describing ember management, and indirect references that hint rather than confirm. Regardless of the academic debate, you know the reality. Warmth rarely lasts long enough for uninterrupted rest. An obscure and unsettling detail appears in several medieval household records. Small earthenware containers filled with heated stones were sometimes wrapped in cloth and placed beneath bedding to prolong warmth. These early warming devices were helpful, but occasionally dangerous if cracked stones retained moisture and fractured when reheated, sometimes scattering fragments unexpectedly. Even comfort had a habit of startling you. You shift slightly, listening to the room settle. Wood contracts in the cooling air with faint ticking sounds. Somewhere near the hearth, a small ember collapses softly into ash. These sounds become part of your sleeping environment, signals rather than disturbances. Silence is never complete. It simply becomes quieter. A dry observation passes through your mind. Nothing wakes you faster than discovering warmth has quietly left without notice. You open your eyes briefly to check the glow of the hearth. It still burns faintly. That faintness reassures you. Too bright would mean the fire is consuming itself too quickly. Too dim would mean you will soon rise unwillingly to coax it back to life. Comfort lies somewhere in the unimpressive middle, the sort of balance no one celebrates. Accepted historical fact. In many northern European households, families kept a small iron rake or wooden poker within arm's reach of sleeping areas specifically, so someone could stir embers without fully rising, preserving heat through the night with minimal effort. It was a small adaptation to an ongoing inconvenience. Another quiet example of how sleep was negotiated rather than guaranteed. You drift toward rest, but not fully. Part of your mind remains attentive, tuned to the subtle signals of temperature change. The sensation is familiar. Your feet cool first, then your hands, then the air near your face sharpens slightly. When this happens, you either pull coverings closer or reluctantly rise to stir the fire again. Fatigue teaches efficiency. Historians still argue whether repeated nightly interruptions affected long-term health, or whether people adapted psychologically to fragmented rest. The question lingers unresolved. From where you lie, the answer feels less theoretical. Exhaustion becomes a background condition, a constant companion rather than an exceptional state. A second restrained joke drifts through your thoughts. At least the cold is predictable, which is more than you can say for most things. Outside, the night deepens. The darkness beyond the walls is complete, pressing against the small openings of the house, indifferent to your attempts at warmth. Inside, the fire holds its modest territory, a fragile center of resistance. You recognize how thin that resistance really is. Another obscure note recorded in rural inventories mentions families sometimes sleeping closer together during severe winters, not only for social reasons, but because combined body heat measurably improved nighttime survival in poorly heated dwellings. Privacy yielded easily when temperatures demanded cooperation. Personal space, like comfort, was a luxury postponed until warmer seasons. You roll slightly toward the hearth, feeling the faint gradient of warmth that still reaches the bedding. You wake before dawn, not because you intend to, but because the cold has returned with quiet determination. The room feels heavier now, the kind of cold that seems to settle into fabric, wood, and bone at once. The fire has not died entirely. Its faint glow survives, but the warmth it once promised has thinned into something symbolic rather than useful. You lie still for a moment, measuring the discomfort, deciding whether the effort of rising outweighs the inconvenience of remaining where you are. Winter often reduces choices to calculations of effort. Before chimneys became common, this final stretch of night was frequently the coldest part of the household cycle. Fires that had been carefully managed through the evening inevitably declined, and unless someone rose to feed them again, the warmth that lingered at midnight could not survive until sunrise. Many households accepted this decline as unavoidable, reserving precious fuel for cooking and daylight heating rather than sustaining full warmth through the entire night. Historians still argue whether early morning fire tending was typically assigned to specific family members, or rotated informally depending on age, health, and fatigue. Written instructions are scarce. Most evidence comes from scattered references suggesting that whoever woke first often became responsible. Duty followed consciousness rather than formal rule. You finally rise, feet touching the cold floor with an immediate shock that travels upward in a quiet line of discomfort. The sensation is familiar, yet it never fully loses its unpleasantness. A faint thought crosses your mind. Nothing motivates morning productivity like the possibility of frost inside your own home. You move toward the hearth, kneeling to examine the ashes. Beneath the gray surface, small pockets of red remain. With practiced patience, you stir them gently, coaxing oxygen into the fragile remains. The process requires care. Too much disturbance scatters the embers. Too little leaves them fading unnoticed. Fire responds to attention, the way tired muscles respond to slow stretching, gradually, reluctantly, but eventually. An accepted historical fact. Many households intentionally preserved banked fires, covering embers with ash overnight, so they would smolder longer and be easier to revive at dawn, reducing the need to create a new fire entirely. The practice saved time and precious tinder, both of which could be scarce in winter months. You add a few thin pieces of kindling, watching for the first faint tongues of flame. The room does not warm immediately. Fire begins modestly, almost shyly, before committing to usefulness. You wait, hands extended slightly forward, not yet feeling relief but trusting the familiar sequence. Patience becomes less a virtue and more a daily survival skill. An obscure and unsettling detail appears in some early household accounts. Families occasionally discovered that overnight embers had quietly extinguished despite careful banking, forcing them to borrow fire from neighbors at dawn sometimes, walking considerable distances in freezing conditions simply to restart warmth. Fire was not guaranteed, even with experience. Dependence extended beyond the walls of the home. Historians still argue whether these small inter-household exchanges of fire contributed significantly to community cohesion, or were simply pragmatic necessities remembered without sentiment. Either way, the act of borrowing flame carried a quiet implication. Warmth was never entirely individual. The kindling finally catches. A thin flame appears, wavering uncertainly, then strengthening as it consumes the smallest sticks. The hearth begins its slow return to relevance. You remain crouched, watching, unwilling to leave until the process is secure. A second dry observation surfaces. You trust fire the way you trust weather forecasts carefully, and only after verification. Behind you, the room remains dim and heavy. Yet already, you can sense a slight shift. Not warmth exactly, but the promise of it. Winter mornings often begin this way. Slow reversals, almost imperceptible improvements, tiny increments that eventually accumulate into tolerable conditions. Another accepted historical note. In colder regions, people often completed small morning tasks, mending clothing, preparing tools, or organizing supplies close to the hearth while waiting for sufficient warmth to spread, effectively compressing activity around the earliest available heat source. The house did not warm evenly, so life concentrated itself where survival. You realize, slowly, that warmth has never truly belonged to you. It has always been borrowed from wood, from neighbors, from careful planning, from patience that stretches longer than comfort prefers. Even now, as the revived fire begins to spread modest heat across the room, the warmth feels temporary, a visitor rather than a possession. You sit near the hearth and understand that every generation before Chimneys lived within the same quiet negotiation, shaping their days and nights around something as basic as surviving winter air. Before widespread chimney adoption in Europe between the 12th and 16th centuries, most households relied on open hearths, positioned centrally or against walls, with smoke escaping through roof openings or simple vents. The later arrival of chimneys did more than redirect smoke. It allowed fires to burn more efficiently, rooms to be arranged differently, and upper floors to remain usable year-round. Yet for centuries before that shift, warmth required constant human attention. Nothing heated itself. Nothing stayed warm unattended. Historians still argue whether the gradual spread of chimneys changed daily life more dramatically through architectural transformation, or through subtle psychological relief, the quiet comfort of knowing that smoke would leave without constant negotiation. The sources disagree. Perhaps both changes mattered equally. You watch the flames move steadily now, their rhythm no longer fragile. The room warms incrementally, but the memory of cold does not vanish as quickly as the sensation itself. Bodies remember discomfort longer than they remember relief. Even when warmth returns, some part of you continues to brace against its absence. An obscure but telling historical detail appears in early building records. Some communities resisted chimney adoption initially, not because the technology was unknown, but because construction costs were significant, and traditional open hearth living arrangements already structured domestic routines. Change arrived unevenly, carried first into wealthier homes while others continued negotiating smoke and cold for generations longer. Progress, like warmth, spread unevenly. A dry thought settles in your mind. Technological revolutions feel less dramatic when they arrive one household at a time. You glance upward toward the dark ceiling, imagining the centuries of smoke that once gathered in similar spaces, coating beams, darkening surfaces, leaving a persistent scent that no season fully removed. Even where chimneys later appeared, the older memory of smoke lingered, an architectural ghost that outlasted the problem itself. Quiet callbacks remain in the smell of old timber, in soot stains discovered during renovations, in the blackened stones hidden behind the plaster. Another accepted historical fact: archaeological examinations of medieval homes often reveal thick soot deposits in rafters dating from periods before chimney installation, clear physical evidence of how households once tolerated indoor smoke for warmth. The structures themselves remember conditions long after written records fade. Historians still argue whether people of those centuries perceive their living conditions as harsh or simply ordinary. Comfort is measured relative to expectation, and expectations form early. From your vantage point, sitting beside the slow, persistent fire, the answer feels less important than the endurance itself. People endured because there was no alternative, not because endurance felt admirable. A second restrained joke surfaces quietly. Central heating may be modern, but disappointment in the weather is timeless. You extend your hands toward the fire again, noticing how instinctively the gesture returns, even when warmth has already begun spreading. Some habits survive long after their urgency fades. The body remembers routines shaped by centuries of necessity, even when circumstances improve. Perhaps that is why, even in well-heated modern rooms, people still gather around fireplaces they do not strictly need. Memory lingers in posture. The fire continues to burn, no longer precarious, yet never entirely secure. You know that by nightfall, the process will begin again. Fuel gathered, embers managed, warmth stretched carefully across hours that always feel longer than expected. Comfort is cyclical here, not permanent. A third bleak joke settles softly into thought. Warmth lasts just long enough to remind you how cold returns. You sit quietly, letting the small territory of heat expand around you, aware that every improvement humanity eventually created chimneys, stoves, insulated walls, controlled heating systems, began as a response to nights like these. Nights where survival depended on attention, patience, and acceptance of constant minor discomforts. History often remembers grand inventions, but the daily persistence that demanded those inventions is easier to overlook. The fire steadies. The room softens. The cold outside does not retreat, but it waits, patient as ever, knowing the cycle will return with evening. You breathe slowly, neither fully comfortable nor fully distressed, existing in the narrow space between those conditions. The same space countless people inhabited for centuries before warmth became effortless. And as the flames continue their quiet work, you recognize that the true history of warmth is not the story of heat itself, but the long record of people learning how to live without enough of it. The fire burns lower now, calmer, quieter, its light stretching across the walls in longer, softer movements. The room settles into a gentler stillness, the kind that arrives not when problems disappear, but when they become familiar enough to stop resisting. You sit without urgency, hands resting loosely, breathing slow and even, allowing the faint warmth to reach you without asking for more. Outside, the cold continues its patient presence, but inside, for this moment, there is balance never perfect, never permanent, yet sufficient. The sounds of the house soften. The faint shifting of wood, the small sigh of air through narrow gaps, the low whisper of embers adjusting themselves. Nothing dramatic happens. Nothing needs to. You feel the weight of long nights that once demanded constant vigilance, and you sense how generations before